السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Jazakallah khair for joining us again for the continuation of our series on the blessed land, Al-Quds. And as even today, as we're watching on the news, it is once again on the news. The Israeli forces have forced themselves in the Masjid al-Aqsa compound, and they are forcibly removing the Muslims from there. And again, this is a constant pattern on the news, and it again re-emphasizes why we are here today discussing the blessed land, how it got to where it was, and inshallah, what we can do about it. Now, just to kind of recap from last time, we went over in our study of the history of the blessed land from the time period of the end of the Uthmani Khilafah to the establishment of the Zionist state of Israel in 1948. And we stop right there. And inshallah, that is where we are going to proceed today. However, I thought, we need to kind of take a step back because things are about to get heavy. The details are about to get bigger. And there are going to be a lot of things that we need to have a framework for so we can properly understand them. Namely, we need to understand from an Islamic perspective, from a rational perspective, like what is sort of like politics? How do we make sense of political events? Now, for the purpose of our series, we're not going to, it's obviously an exhaustive topic, but we're going to focus on one concept. And that specifically that there are different types of states that are vying for control, power, political influence, etc. We have, on one hand, leading states. Now, these are states that actually have a vision. These are people, they want something more. They have a vision that they're willing to work for, to fight for, to make sure it is established on the earth, right? These are states, nations that are independent. They don't wait for orders from other people. They control their own destiny. They manifest their own destiny. They make events happen, or they use them in order to push their vision. These are also states that are self-sufficient. Again, these are the leading states. Now, after that, we have what you can refer to as orbiting states. Now, these states, as the name kind of indicates, as a concept sort of indicates, they move around the leading states. They're not independent, that they form their own destiny, so to speak, but they have some level of autonomy. They have some sort of decision-making process, but they don't necessarily have a vision for the future. They don't necessarily have a vision for the world. They don't have something that they're fighting to spread, to emanate. They have certain national interests that they're kind of working for, and these are kind of orbiting states. And lastly, what we can call is we have subordinated states. Now, these are states or nations that have almost no independence. You could almost think of them as almost like slave nations, slave states. And most of the time, they don't, again, make their own decisions. They are told what to do. They act, and they act in the behalf of the leading states. Again, so we have leading states. They control their destiny. They work for a vision. They want to enact a certain reality in the world, and they're going to work to make it happen. We have orbiting states, kind of care about what's going on in their own realm, have some sort of interest, but they're kind of still looking at, okay, who's the big guy? Let me follow him around a little bit. And then we have the subordinated states, the lackeys. The guys are just in it for their own personal gain. They don't even have a vision. Their nations are almost dysfunctional. They're third world. They, it's kind of crazy. Now, this might seem as something that's a little bit strange, right? I mean, here we are in the masjid talking about the affairs of states and stuff. But this is nothing new. This is nothing new in Islam. Actually, there's a whole surah that talks about just observation, not observation, of things that were happening in the time of Rasulullah. In Surah Rum, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, starting from the second ayat, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم غلبت الروم. The Romans have been defeated. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues, في أدنى الأرض وهم من بعد غلبهم سيغلبون. In the near land, and they, referring to the Romans, after their defeat will be triumphant. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues, في بضع سنين لله أمر من قبل ومن بعد ويومئذ يفرح المؤمنون. They will be triumphant, Allah continues, within a few years. To Allah belongs the matter before and thereafter. And on that day, the believers will rejoice. Now, what is this event that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commentating on? It was in the time of Rasulullah a competition between the two leading nations at the time. The Romans on one hand and the Persians on the other. And they are fighting for their vision, for control, for power. And they're in this constant struggle. And it looks like the Romans are being defeated. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, in these ayat, that after their defeat, they will be triumphant, and they were. And this is a little snippet of, just to kind of connect it back, right? This is a little snippet of history that we talked about earlier, right? That Bani Israel, as the topic is about Al-Quds, after they abandoned their prophets, after they lost prophetic leadership, they were a cursed nation, ping-ponged by the leading nations, by the superpowers of the time. So they were actually with the Persians during this interim period. And when the Persians had their little bit of victory, they had control of Jerusalem. And when the Romans won again, bam, they're out. They're kicked out. They're banned from Jerusalem once again. Anyways, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is bringing our attention to this very situation that's unfolding. And who were the Arabs at the time? For using this framework, they weren't even orbiting powers. They were basically like slave nations. They were people no one cared about. There were people that had no say in the affairs of the world, and no one even cared about them. There were some people in Arabia that had no control over nothing. They were insignificant, right? And for some of you guys that have read the Seerah, right? The Syrian part of the Arabs at that time was a little more prominent, more habitable, more trade going on, more caravans flowing through it. And this was kind of in the Persian territories. So even when Rasulullah was reaching out to various tribes for nusra, for power, before the people of Medina accepted, he would approach various tribes, and some of them had conditions. Yeah, we will accept you, but we can't. One condition: we can't fight the Persians. They're the big guys, etc. So this is important to understand, both when we're understanding the Seerah, both when we're understanding the Quran, and equally so when we are understanding the reality before us today. Now, we kind of hit on that. So who were the leading nations in time of this particular ayat, right? They were the Romans and the Persians. And who were the orbiting nations? We could say maybe it was the Syrians. And who were the subordinate nations? They were the Arabs pre-Islam. Now let's jump forward to 1948. Who are the actors before us? Well, we have the leading nations, which are the British and the French, who, as we spoke about last time, were the people that carved up the Muslim Ummah, the Muslim world. And then primarily the British. And then there's something changing in the atmosphere that we'll kind of get into in around the 1948 time. Is that there's other leading nations that are emerging, namely the Americans and anyone know? No, not the British, the Soviets. Right? We're getting into the Cold War era. Right? We're going to kind of come back to that. Okay, so that's kind of what the leading nations are. Now, who are the orbiting nations? Nations that have some sort of say in what's going on, but still they're following the agendas of the superpowers of the time, right? They have some sort of autonomy, they have some sort of say. Who are these nations? Well, for our analysis of Al-Quds, they are primarily, Israel, the European Union, the states of Europe, and sort of other parties in the area. Now, who are the subordinated nations? Any guess? The people that have no say. It is unfortunately, after the Muslims, fell apart, it was the states of Jordan, states of Egypt, and the states of Syria. These are the three actors that in this current history that we're going to come back and focus on, right? So just to recap it really quick before we move on, because there will be details, and I don't want us to necessarily get lost. Who are the leading nations? The British in relation to Al-Quds. Okay, who is vying for power next? Who's the next guy that's kind of coming in the stage? The Americans. Okay, who are the orbiting nations? Nations that have some sort of say, Israel, and some of the various European states. Now, who are the subordinated nations that don't even have control of their own armies, don't even have control over their own say of what happens? It is unfortunately the states of the Muslims, the Syrians, the Egyptians, the Jordanians. Okay. Now let's talk about the environment a little bit, right? We got the players in the field. Okay, but what's going on around us? So in our previous sessions, we talked about one of the most significant events that occurred in our recent history, and even in our Islamic history, was the onslaught of World War I. We had the Central Powers on one side, and we had the Allied powers on one side. And the Allied powers secured a victory, a military victory, right? Amongst the Central Powers was our nation, our people, the Uthmani Khilafah. That was our last Islamic nation. Now, as we won't get into all the details, but obviously after World War I, the Muslims in Istanbul, the center of the Osmani Khilafah, were in a weakened state. A man named Mustafa Kemal was able to secure a position of power because of various things that were happening at that moment. Mustafa Kemal, the traitor of the Ummah, abolished the institution of the Khilafah, a feat that had never occurred voluntarily by any Muslims, and previously which only occurred for 3 years under the onslaught of the Mongols. And today we're almost 100 years on. Okay, anyways. So World War I, the Muslims, the Uthmani Khilafah was disbanded. The Muslim Ummah as we know it was divided. We have Egypt, we have Syria, we have Jordan, etc. Okay. But we're reaching now to 1948. There's something else that's kind of significant that happened. Any guesses? It is the year before Pakistan was formed, but that's not the most significant thing. So, World War II. So between 1939 and 1945, there's another big event that's happening. Now this is changing the actors on the field, right? We had the British and French after World War I, they came out as the victors. They split the lands, they cut them up. The British said, we have Palestine. The French said, we have Algeria, etc. They divided it up. Now, obviously the kuffar, the enemies of Allah, they're greedy. Even when they're in victory, they seem united when they're against Islam, like when they were against the Uthmani Khilafah. But what happens when they have victory? Well, they fight amongst themselves. The Europeans, in their greed, started competing for colonization. Who has Africa? Who has what? This, in a nutshell, led to also World War II. And because of the devastation of World War II, the immense lives that were lost, Europe, as we know it, was in all practical ways destroyed. They were in a distraught state. And on all the way on the other side of the ocean, guess who was making some money off this? The Americans, right? So here we see the rise, the ascension of America as a nation before that time that was maybe an orbiting state, maybe a state that's just doing its own thing, a regional power, to now a world player, a leading state. And also the Soviets, right? But this has a little bit less relation to our goods for our study at this moment. So keep this in mind, right? So this is the backdrop that we are going to see certain events unfolding on our stage, right? So we got our actors, we have the big events in the background going on. Okay, now let's see what happens. Now, in the next sort of segment, and anyone that's watching the time, please keep me aware. I know we have about 30 minutes for the session. But in this next segment, inshallah, we're going to get into some of the details about what happened. Specifically, we're going to focus on what happens after 1948, when Israel is declared, and the subsequent wars with the regional Arab powers. What happened? Because a lot of the times we hear, man, it's impossible. You can't beat them. They're invincible. Haven't you seen? Like all the Muslims fought them. All the Arabs fought them. They didn't win. You know, this is the things we hear, especially if you're from those regions. And so we're going to get into some of those details of what exactly happened, right? For some parts of it, I will have to sort of read a little bit, get into the details, but inshallah, after that we can comment, clarify. I just wanted to say now, before we move forward, one, can we get a timestamp? And number two, before we get into all those details, is there anything that was unclear that you guys want to hit right now, or any pending questions, or just anything maybe you want to even add? And for our online viewers, you can obviously leave a comment, and we can get to them later. Okay, to proceed. So we are on May 14, 1948, and the British mandate over Palestine has expired. The Jewish National Council declares the establishment of Israel, and following this announcement, the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq immediately invade the new country. Okay, so let's see kind of what happened there. Now, again, the backdrop is, okay, the British mandate is over, right? 1948, this is after World War II. The British are a waning power, and now the Americans are a rising power, and we're going to see struggles. Okay, so what happens next? The war is declared. During the 1948 war, King Abdullah of Jordan rallied the Arab Legion troops to fight for Palestine, or so they said. He claimed that they would be in Jerusalem within a week. But this is not the reality we saw. Now, was it because the Muslims were weak? No. Do you know who the armies of the Jordanians was led by? Anybody aware? It was, yes, it was the British officer, John Glubb. Well, let's just put that back in our framework, right? I made some claims in the beginning, right? There's leading nations, there's orbiting nations, and then there's subordinate nations. Now, let me ask you a question. If the British officer, John Glubb, was to lead the 4 regiments into, if this is the guy leading your army, do you have control over your army? No. Do you have control over your nation? No. Do you have any sort of independence? No, you don't. Okay, Jordan is a subordinate nation. So, okay, the British officer John Glubb was to lead the 4 regiments, Jordanian regiments, to the areas which were allegedly allocated to the Muslims under the UN mandate. John Glubb later wrote that he had been given clear instructions to this effect. So John Glubb himself recounts later on, he's an officer of whom? The British nation. So he's under them. And now he's on top of the Jordanian army. So he recounts later that he was given instructions, okay, take the Muslims against the fight with Israel, but stop at this line. This line that was declared by the British mandate. Yeah, show them a little bit of fireworks, but hey, you know what? Don't cross this line. And that's exactly what happened. And to compound that, in 1947, in early 1948, there was some secret meetings that obviously came out later between King Abdullah and the Israelis, where King Abdullah had offered to accept the establishment of Israel in return for Jordanian control over Arab populated areas of Palestine. Now, the word of this got out, and these meetings didn't go any further. But applying that framework once again, let's take a look at that, right? Let's just review the events that happened. 1948, Israel is the British mandate is ending, so Israel has declared its independence as an independent nation. The so-called Arab powers, which were actually the carved up territories of the British and French, invade the area. They are ruled by British officers in their military. The British officers are given instructions that, hey, don't go beyond this line. And in the background, the so-called leaders are meeting hand in hand with the Israelis and saying, hey, you know what? We can accept it. Why not? You know, you can do your thing, but hey, just give us a little piece of the pie. You know, we want to be on the table. You know, give us a little piece of the pie. You can do your thing. These are the people that were on top of us. And how did the Israelis respond? Right? They set a precedence that they continue until today. They responded with the massacre of Deir Yassin, where more than 100, I think it's maybe even more than 107, something like that, more than 100 men, women, and children were butchered. They're leaving their mark that they continue today. But King Abdullah is happy about what he has. These, you know, other nations are happy. Really quick, what's the timestamp? We have 9:12. Okay. So okay, inshallah, let's keep moving. Okay, let's keep moving forward. So just let me know like 5 minutes before. Okay, 1949. After more than a year of fighting, there is an armistice. There is a cease of fighting after 1 year. And now the territories of Al-Quds, of Palestine, is split. Israel controls the Negev region and the coastal plain, while Jordan rules the West Bank, and Egypt controls the Gaza Strip. Okay, so we had some divide and control in the beginning of the Muslim land. Okay, so now we're taking a smaller piece of Muslim land and dividing it and placing a alien body within it, the Zionist state of Israel. Okay, let's keep moving forward. And what happens to the Muslims that were living in those areas? They're made refugees. And so here's a pattern that we're going to see kind of going forward, right? And that we saw in this little snippet in between 1948 and 1949 is that the Arab rulers that were allowed to rule, right? So who controlled the area? The British and the French. So who ruled in those areas? Obviously, people that the British and the French allowed to rule, right? Okay, so the Arab rulers that were allowed to rule never had the objective of freeing Al-Quds. They never had the objective of freeing Palestine, as we've seen. They followed what was given to them. I mean, man, heck, their armies were the officers of the British and French. But even so, they never had that desire. They never had that vision, right? To change the world, to take Al-Quds. They're given an active play by the leading nations, and they're like, okay, let's do it. As long as I get my piece of the pie, I'm okay with it. And we're going to see this pattern continue, right? They were ready to negotiate, you know, without any issue, and they were happy to accept a small piece of the pie for letting go of something much greater. And I want to, I guess for the interest of time, we're going to keep going, but just a quick link back to right of the Uthmani period. How did Sultan Abdul Hamid respond to the Zionists? They offered him everything, and he wasn't willing to give an inch of it. And now we have some of these rulers that are willing to give everything for nothing. Anyways, let's proceed. 1950, King Abdullah incorporates the West Bank and East Jerusalem into Jordan, and the annexation is only recognized by Britain and Pakistan. July 1952. So we talked about this era, right? There is a shift in the leading powers, right? World War II decimated the European powers, the British, and now there's an ascending power. So what happens in Egypt? So in 1952, Egyptian military leaders launch a coup and overthrow King Farouk. And now Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser becomes the president of Egypt. Okay, there's an event that occurred. Egypt transitioned from Farouk to Gamal Abdel Nasser. Now, just like the times are changing, the states are changing in order, in the vision of now the leading nations. King Farouk was a British guy. Gamal Abdel Nasser, even though the history doesn't I mean, the history now makes it very clear, he was an American guy. Okay, let's keep moving forward. This will become clear, inshallah, as we move forward. July 1956, Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal in order to finance the Aswan Dam. Now, October or November 1956, Israel, in collusion with England and France, Israel, in collusion with England and France. Again, Israel working with, they're an orbiting nation. Israel, in collusion with England and France, invades Egypt, taking the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula. The British and French forces bomb Egypt, and the British and French alliance seizes the Suez Canal, and the US forces that are stationed there in the area are embarrassed and retreat from the British. So the 1956 Suez Canal conflict that we're really talking about, in actuality, in reality, when we look back into it, was a struggle between the American and the British for control of the extremely important, strategically important Suez Canal. And I'm sure you guys remember, it was maybe a month ago or two months ago, the Suez Canal got blocked by a giant ship, right? Do you guys recall that? And by the minute, by the day, the world was losing, billions, of dollars, like huge sums of money. Why? Because it's a very, very important strategic point that, so this was used as a battleground for influence. Okay, let's move forward. So in the 1956 war between Egypt and Israel was never about the liberation of Palestine. Far from it. Nasser never wanted to eliminate Israel. His focus was primarily in removing British control over the Suez Canal. The US saw Egypt as a critical ally if America was to gain influence in the Middle East. Through the CIA, the US deposed the British King Farouk in a coup, and bringing Gamal Abdel Nasser into power. It's kind of funny. I want to share just a small statement, if we have time, about the. Okay, so we'll just skip it. But there's an interesting statement from the U.S. president at the time, Eisenhower. We'll come back to it later if there's time, and maybe you guys can ask him a question and answer the session after. Okay, let's move forward. 1958, Egypt and Syria combine to form the United Arab Republic, and this dissolves bitterly in 1961. Again, so they united under the false concepts of nationalism, right? their visions are so small. Like, okay, they've been given two pieces. Okay, here's who you guys are. Yeah, I mean, you can come together, but it's nationalistic. We're Arab. We're these people. It's not on the basis of we are Muslims. It's not on the basis of if the Muslims in Palestine are hurting, we're hurting. If the Muslims in Kashmir are hurting, we're hurting. No, it was okay. Let's come together. And like false concepts, like corrupted concepts, they broke apart. 1963, there's a military coup in Syria. We won't go into this in detail, but Syria is a land of coups. You know, Syria has always been an unstable nation with lots of coups happening all the time, lots of changes of power, lots of conflict, and obviously we see that even today. You know, may Allah SWT make the make Syria a land of good news for us, and make it easy for all the Muslims struggling there. Anyways, so there was a coup in Syria, and the Muslims are left divided. They're controlled. They're made busy, and at the same time, you know, we see these people fighting for their national interests. You know, whether it's the Syrians, the Egyptians, etc. And on the other hand, we see the Muslims of Al-Quds, the Muslims of Palestine, begging for help. Okay. I'll try to kind of keep it short. In 1964, the PLO begins. The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, is created, and it starts fighting for the recognition of Palestine as an independent state. So again, are these guys leading nations, orbiting nations, or subordinate nations? Well, they're not even a nation, but what are their aspirations? What is their vision? They want recognition from the same people that cut them up, right? The UN, etc., all these people. And at the same time, by asking for the recognition of Palestine, they are inadvertently saying that we recognize Israel. So Israel has a legitimate right to exist. As you guys said, you know, as you guys said that they have the right to exist. Fine, okay, give it to us too, you know. So the PLO further works under the superpowers and the nationalistic nation state framework that they have created. It's like saying, you know, oh fine, you know, you got your state, come on, let us have ours too. Okay, let's proceed. In 1967, the 6 Days War. So we're going to cover the 6 Days War, and I think based on the interest of time, we're going to stop there. But there is some really important points I want to make right after this. So I'm going to do my best to get through this. So 1967, the War of 1966, again, occurs. This is the 6-Day War. And unlike the previous wars, there's something interesting happens here, right? Where previously Israel had preemptive strikes. Actually, let's just get through it. So 1967, right, is another episode in the British-American conflict for control. In an attempt to weaken Nasser, Britain sought to lure Israel to drag Egypt into a war whereby Israel would seize territory and use it as a bargaining tool for a land for peace settlement. Okay, again, did Israel invent this? No, they were lured. They were following the orbit of other powers, the British in this case, for a land for peace deal. So on June 5th, 1967, Israel launched a preemptive strike, destroying 3/5 of Egypt's ground air force and 2/3 of the Syrian and Jordanian combat aircrafts. So it's kind of funny now. Here's a funny coincidence, right? We'll use it like this, a funny coincidence. So right before this attack, King Hussein of Jordan, prior to the battle, had positioned his troops in a completely different area, okay? From where the main battle was taking place. Kind of funny, right? Okay, well, again, let me give you another funny detail. In a matter of 48 hours, the Israelis seized the major West Bank town, and most of those who were shot dead of the Jordanian forces were in retreat. Okay. At the same time, they were on the Syrian front, right? Now, the Syrian troops, as they're in the middle of battle, okay, the Syrian troops occupying the Golan Heights, they hear on the news being broadcasted that news of Israel's capture of the strategically important Golan Heights. So let me rephrase that. So the Syrian soldiers are fighting in the Golan Heights for that territory. Israel is coming and invading. They hear from their own news outlets, breaking news, Israel has controlled the Golan Heights, and they're in the middle of the fight. They're probably wondering what the heck is going on. And I mean, now today, some of us are still wondering what's going on. Okay, anyways, moving forward, right? So what was the objective of this? The objective of the weakening was to weaken the regime of Nasser, which was achieved indirectly, thus aiding the British interests. Israel was able to seize more land and use it as a bargaining asset in a land for peace negotiations. So basically, Israel is like the dog barking for like a biscuit for survival, right? It has a little bit more land, they can buy a little bit more time. And again, the scenes that were unfolding, who are the leading nations? They are basically like you could say in an analogy, like the directors of the movie. These guys are the guys calling the shots. Now, who are the actors? The Israelis on one side, the Egyptians on the other side, and the Syrians, and we're seeing what's going on. Okay, 1973. The 1973 October War was designed to solidify the positions of Sadat and Assad in a prelude to peace. So who were Anwar Sadat and Hafiz al-Assad? Anwar Sadat was the runner-up, the successor to Nasser or Jamal Abdel Nasser, and Hafiz al-Assad, as we know, we know how disgusting of a people there, but as we know, he was the runner to Syria. So this was a pretext for solidifying their power again, because they are under the American orbit, right? So we see again Muslims are being ping-ponged, etc. Okay, so again, going back to in 1973, war was launched by Egypt and Syria against Israel, and the aims again were never to liberate Palestine. The aims were never even include the liberation of the Golan Heights, which were designed to be restored as a part of a peace treaty between Syria and Israel. The aims were to solidify the positions of Anwar Sadat and Hafiz al-Assad, who were relatively new leaders in countries prone to military coups. Sadat in particular was vulnerable given the fact that he had succeeded the charismatic Jamal Abdel Nasser. So these were new guys on the block that had to show that they're tough, that had to show they were being respected, that the regimes could stay. And that's why they had a preemptive strike against Israel, to show that, hey, we're powerful people. And they had a little bit of a victory. And let's see what happens. Let's see what they did with it. Okay, let's see what they did with it. So in a position of victory, in a position of power, okay, now let's see what these people do. So in their position of power, they sought peace with Israel while commanding a winning position in the war. In the first 24 hours of the war, from October 6th, Egypt smashed through the Israelis' fortifications east of the Suez Canal with only 68 casualties. At the same time, 2 Syrian divisions and 500 tanks swept through the Golan Heights and retook some of the land captured in 1967. Check this out. In 2 days of fighting, Israel had lost 49 aircrafts and 500 tanks. Do these people sound invincible to you? Not to me. 2 days. After this achievement, but what do they want? They're like, oh, we want peace. We want peace with Israel. It was part of so they said the objective of the war was the achievement of peace in the Middle East. We want peace in the Middle East, not partial settlements. Now, there's a lot more details we can get into, but in the interest of time, I want to kind of keep this episode a little bit small. But I mean, just look at it, man. Like, in a position of power, they jumped to the negotiation table and they wanted peace. They smashed through the Israeli fortifications. They smashed through their tanks. They destroyed their armaments, but they wanted peace. As some of you guys might be aware, what does peace mean? Any guesses what peace actually means? Peace in the political process means maintaining the status quo, maintaining the stage how it is, maintaining the positions how they are, maintaining the actors where they sit. Peace means not rocking the boat. Peace means, hey, you're the power, okay, you stay where you're at. So the Muslim rulers were dependent on the superpowers under their peace. And in victory, handed over the decision of the land they conquered to the UN. Does that sound like an independent nation to you? No. Does that sound like people that control their vision to you? No. Does that sound like people that manifest their destiny, that change the world, shape the world in what they see? It doesn't. Okay. So the next we're going into the era of 1974, etc. But I want to kind of keep it that those are the two major, some of the major conflicts that we hear about a lot, right? In times of weakness, when the Arab rulers, the so-called Arab rulers and the so-called Muslim rulers, they fought, they had British officers over them. They followed the lines that were prescribed for them, and they did not move 1 inch beyond what was their mandate, what the leading nations had declared. In times of victory, they said, hey, man, we want peace. Hey, we want peace according to what the leading powers say, what the UN says, what the US says. Whatever they say is our peace. So they never had an objective to liberate Palestine. And again, the series is about the Holy Land, so let's get back to it. So here, I want to kind of quickly get to the main points of today's talk, right? And if you take anything away, I want you brothers to please take away these 4 points, 3 to 4 points. Number one, despite the myths that we grew up hearing of invincibility, of strength, of unbeatability, the truth is Israel is a dependent and fragile nation whose existence is complicit on both the superpowers, the leading powers, whether that's the British or the Americans or whoever becomes the leading power, and its neighbors. Number two, that the neighboring Muslim, quote unquote, Muslim or Arab countries around Israel were structured by the superpowers of the time after the destruction of the Khilafah in 1924. And they only worked on objectives that were related to securing their personal interests and in the orbit or subordination of the leading powers. They were never independent. Number three, kind of building on from our previous sessions, right? The main point is when Bani Israel abandoned prophetic leadership and obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they were transformed into a cursed nation that was dependent for its survival on the superpowers of the time, whether it was the Romans or the Persians or the British or the Americans, etc. They were a nation that was ping-ponged. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not remind us of Bani Israel just for fun, right? And unfortunately today, the Muslim Ummah lives in a similar situation due to the same issues because we have abandoned prophetic leadership and the collective obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number four. Compared to the dark reality that we have before us, I want to take a quick jump back into the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What was the surah that I read in the beginning? It was Surah Rum, right? At that time, the Muslims had not established the state of Medina, right? At the time, they were in a state of weakness. The world, the Arabs at the time, they thought they were big hotshots in Mecca, but there were nobodies to the rest of the world. They were watching the Romans and the Persians. But what happened when Rasulullah created his independent state in Medina, the first Islamic state? Did he operate under the same framework? No, he didn't. The Muslim Ummah is, what did he do? Under the leadership of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, letters were dispatched to the leading nations of the world with authority, with no fear. I'll never forget the scene from the message. It's just a movie, but it's a perfect metaphor for what happened, right? If you guys remember how the movie starts, is there's three horsemen. They're running through the deserts of Arabia, and they split up, one here, one here, one here. And you see, from Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam to the Emperor of Rome, from Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam to the leader of the Persians, from Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, etc. No fear. And after they rejected, what did Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam do? Declared war upon them. And we learned that victory belongs to those who are under prophetic leadership and those who obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the point is, the Muslim Ummah is always supposed to be a leading nation. No matter how big or small they are, the Muslim Ummah is supposed to be a leading nation. And the mission, with the mission of making the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the highest in the world. So the Muslim Ummah lives to make the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the highest. Unlike the other nations, unlike even the other leading nations, they're not interested in power for the sake of power. They're not interested for wealth for the sake of wealth. They're not interested for money, wealth, women, etc. They're interested in making the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the highest. That is their vision that they build everything upon. And you accept it. If you don't accept it, well, the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam makes it happen, as we've seen. And the only valid leadership in Islam is under the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And obviously, since the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam died, through his instruction to his successors, which are the Khulafa. And one last thing I want to say, or the second to last thing I want to say, is the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam will never be free unless it returns to that. Returns to being a leading nation. Returns to be a people that want to make the words of Allah the highest in the land. And if you don't accept it, too bad. We're going to make it happen. And I want to end with one of the sayings of the second Khulafa of the Muslimin, Umar ibn al-Khattab, and on this we'll end it and open the floor for question and answers. So what did Umar ibn al-Khattab say? The second Khulafa of the Muslims, the second successor to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Amir al-Mu'minin. He said, "We were the most humiliated people on earth." Talking about the Arabs, before Islam. We were the most humiliated people on earth, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us honor through Islam. If we ever seek honor through anything else, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will humiliate us again. Where do we find ourselves today? Humiliated. Inshallah, we will continue from 1974 going forward, and inshallah, as we kind of get through the history, we will also talk about the movements and talking about the causes for the liberation of Palestine, right? Because kind of tying it back to Al-Quds, whatever was good, it was from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and whatever mistakes from mine, I would appreciate any corrections, etc. as we go forward. So inshallah, we're going to open the floor for question and answers, and for the audiences online, you're welcome to comment, participate in that. And inshallah, see you guys at the next session. Assalamu alaikum.